I'd like to introduce my presentation initially by bringing your attention to the three main themes. The first is wildness, the other, conversation, and the third, transformation. I hope that your eyes will widen a little and that your eyebrows rise a touch. Please do this with me. Take the fingertip of your hand and draw it towards the palm of your other hand. Delicately, respectfully, touch and retract. In this momentary meeting, where one part of yourself meets another, converses, is awoken. There's a consciousness that is awoken between one part of yourself and another. Now consider the notion of getting familiar with what we would otherwise call a thing, and from now on I will call a phenomenon. It is a word that derives from the Greek meaning to appear. When we experience a phenomenon such as a beautiful sunset, we go silent, filled with wonder and a heightened awareness similar to that when you touched the palm of your hand. We know how the photographic stop frame sequences the infinitesimal changes of a sunset or a flower unfolding. Here the technology is active and not you. I am suggesting that you become an active, imaginative creator of sequences. In order to do this, we must slow down and still our rational mind, which cannot stand uncertainty and unknowing. At the same time, we must be aware of the danger of the cursory, responsive, dismissive familiarity. Oh, I know that plant, it's a wild geranium. The chances are we know very little about that plant, and simply name it. In flexing our imaginative muscle, we gain the ability to think growth, and through this, develop a more flexible and agile way of thinking, a thinking which embraces life. As often as possible, I immerse myself in the wild world of nature, brushing against the tough leaf body of the fynbos, touched by the fragility of its flowers, sensing the unseen. In stretching my imagination into the depths and mystery of a flower, the phenomenon communicates information that couldn't be done in any other way. It is here in the wild that we discover unexpected conversational partners to help limber up our stiff thinking. Steve Talbot of the New York Nature Institute asserts, if humankind fails to embrace with its sympathies and understanding every wild thing, then both we and the world will to that extent be diminished. Here, wild pertains to a quality, alive and generative, as opposed to the concept wilderness, something tamed, groomed, possibly a place for that last wild thing. Some years ago, I took a group of design students on a trip to the brutal and beautiful Richtersveld to work on a project with a group of indigenous people. The bus journey came to an abrupt halt in the apparent darkness after we temporarily lost sight of our guiding car. In the silence of the desert night, suppressed snivelings of panic arose from these 20-something-year-olds, faced with no cell phone reception, deeply in the wild and unknown. I told the students to get off the bus. and invited them to join me under the night sky. Tears streaming down faces and arms clasped around themselves, they shambled off the bus. The stillness of the desert sky communicated its silence to them, and slowly their mouths dropped open as they awoke to the immensity and life of the night sky. I could not have asked for a more apt and permanent transition from one inner landscape into another in preparing for the processes that we were about to engage in. We must all find the courage to step off the bus, off that erosion-causing rational path into the untamed, ungroomed, slippery slope of the wild, and find our way back to ourselves and to the world. Postmodern relativism has taken us away from ourselves into a prison of sleepy abstraction. From Christopher Fry's play, A Sleep of Prisoners, comes the urgent plea, "Will you wake for pity's sake?" Now I want to turn to the specifics of conversation. All conversational encounters involve a breathing rhythm of minute gestures of movement. In sympathy, one leans forward, an interest to listen to the other. Then, in an opposite gesture of antipathy, not necessarily in a negative way, retract a little to reflect, just as you experienced when touching the palm and retracting your finger. Some 200 years ago, poet, scientist Johann Wolfgang von Goethe urged us to move beyond the shallow, disconnected observation of an observer status and become participants in our world. One might say, conversational partners with our world. But today's fragmented, interrupted, arrhythmic way of life leaves little possibility for silence, or for that matter, a breathing conversation. And with phenomenal technology, we run the risk of simply amassing data without wisdom. This mental thinking deprives us of our profound engagement with the world by reducing it to the notion of a piece of real estate. This has passed its sell-by date. Looking at nature as a collection of unrelated units, resources, products, or mechanisms leads to such insanities as feeding animal remains to herbivores, such as cows. Talbot asserts that this type of conversation becomes a mad, free-associating soliloquy. Goethe gave us qualitative processes with which to develop new organs of perception and make them trustworthy. One of the first exercises I do on a cross-pollination workshop to ease participants into their imagination is for the students to hold a bean in their hand. To, with all their senses, observe the bean, and then with their imagination, move into its emergent life. Through this process, they look and see with their imagination, their mind's eye, the unfolding from root through to stem, through to leaf, flower, and seed. Then, with a fake imitation bean, they repeat the exercise. You will discover in doing this exercise that the first bean sends an invitation to converse, to participate in its metamorphosis, like infinity in the palm of your hand, whereas the imitation bean is ready-made with no journey of inner development to share. I encourage my students to step into the flow of life with every phenomenon they encounter, whether it be a community need, artistic process, institutional conflict, design brief, or family issue, in the hope of deepening their practice and their thinking towards a genuinely holistic and living response in our world. In bringing social sensitivity and ecological awareness closer, they explore the role of designer as mediator between nature and culture. This is done with the same sensitivity and intent with which you touched the palm of your hand with your finger. Wholeness is a way of seeing. We can no longer afford to view the whole as a no thing, a nothing, nor issues environmental as something we manage with merely our mental ability. The repercussions of ignoring wholeness, of remaining stuck in a detached observer status as clever gatherers of data, are already evident in the extreme angst and chaos that is rife throughout our societies, where people are demanding conversation, transformation, inclusion. Traditional science is largely a science that in its proclaimed impartiality has only managed a partial awareness of life. We acknowledge the absurdity of apartheid as a political system, yet we continue to practice separate development in our fundamental scientific approach, where we avoid investigating what lives between. In contrast, the broad framing of a Goethean practice is the pursuit of a composite knowledge, the striving to see the whole, and the whole is the sense of interdependence, of belonging together, of conversation. It is the African understanding of Ubuntu. 100 years ago, D.H. Lawrence warned of the risks of not striving for this. Sanity means the wholeness of the consciousness, and our society is only part conscious like an idiot. If we do not rapidly open all the doors of consciousness and freshen the putrid little space in which we are cribbed, the sky blue walls of our unventilated heaven will be bright red with blood. Teetering on the precipice of our collective future, each individual is summoned as never before to remember our greatest human potential, which is our full consciousness. And this full consciousness is dependent on our ability, through sensitive conversation with the wildness, for our transformation. Thank you.